Welcome to Books in Five, where we are interviewing authors of recently published books on relevant topics. I'm very happy today because I have the author of this great new book that you can see over my shoulder. It is called Canada First, Not Canada Alone, and we have Adam Chapnick here with us. Hi, Adam. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Let's jump right into it with question number one. Your book highlights Canada's foreign policy over the previous century. Can you help us understand what you mean by foreign policy broadly, why you felt this topic needed to be written about, and what Canada's objectives have been as it has navigated the major events and developments of this time period?
So, foreign policy refers to what Canada does in the world, and it's broad. It's not just diplomacy, it's not just defense, it's not just international development, it's also environmental policy, it's also immigration policy. Any time that Canada is interacting with other countries around the world, particularly when it's country to country, we're talking about foreign policy. The reason for writing this book is there hasn't been a book quite like this that explains all of Canada's history in foreign policy history in a way that would be accessible, especially to a university audience or to journalists trying to figure out what's going on in the world or what has gone on in the world. There hasn't been really a book like this in about 20 years. And there hasn't been a book like this that uses case studies, short explorations of individual events in Canadian foreign policy history to understand the bigger picture. There hasn't been a book like that in 30 years. So there was plenty of foreign policy that's taken place since the last time this type of book has been written. And my co-author Asa McKercher and I thought it was time to put together something new and much more up to date than what was available in the past.
Great. Yeah. So let's jump into the meat of this question, which is, again, what are Canada's objectives? What is it looking to accomplish as it interacts with the world around it?
Generally speaking, what Canada's trying to do is promote, defend, and advance its interests in the world. And we have economic interests, we have defense and security interests, we have environmental interests, we have immigration interests. And we can't, as the book suggests with the title Canada First, Not Canada Alone, it's very hard to advance those interests working without others. We aren't, with 41 odd million people in a world of 8 billion, we just don't have the pure strength, be that economic or military, to enforce our will on others without working with other countries, without working through international organizations, without working through alliances. So foreign policy is very much about trying to get the things we need for our country, like peace and security, like economic prosperity, like maintaining national unity in the face of all sorts of challenges taking place around the world that affect us here at home. So it's doing all those things and making use of our allies and building relationships in order to be more effective in doing so.
Great. So I want to delve into something that you just brought up, which is the national unity aspect, and that was prevalent throughout your book. Can you talk a little bit more about that as the prime objective of Canadian policymakers with regard to foreign policy?
And one of the big challenges in Canada, because we have such huge geography, the political culture in the country isn't singular. People who grow up in British Columbia, where you are, I believe, have a much different understanding of Canada inherently just because of the weather. The fact that trade, when you think of trade in British Columbia, you think of trading with Asia, whereas people in the Maritimes think of trade, they think of trading with Europe. Temperature means that the industries that prosper in different parts of the country are profoundly different. And most important, in the early history of Canada, the national unity issue was very much between French-speaking Quebecers and English speakers in the rest of Canada. English speakers in the rest of Canada, particularly in the early years of Canadian foreign policy, had very strong British roots. And as a result, when they thought about Canada and its place in the world, they thought in terms of Great Britain. Great Britain didn't come to mind so much with French-speaking Quebecers, which made them have much different opinions over, for example, how much Canada should contribute to the First World War, where the English-speaking Canadians felt if Britain is going all out, we should as well, even if we have to force people to enroll in the armed forces. French speakers from Quebec thought of things much differently.
So our final 30 seconds with this question, can you just talk a little bit about the importance of Quebec with regard to foreign policy and keeping them online and on board?
As the second most populous province, Quebec has a significant impact on a government's ability to be reelected. So ignoring the views of Quebecers in foreign policy risked the fall of a government. As a result, since Quebecers tended to have, especially early on, a much different approach to the world, they had a disproportionate influence on the way we made foreign policy decisions.
Great. I think this is a great opportunity for us to move to our second question. And you brought it up a little bit earlier, which is, you begin the book with a description of the relations that the people who inhabited the land that now makes up Canada had with the outside world leading up to World War II and the critical importance that Britain played. Can you help us understand the history of this connection between the colonists and Britain in the pre-Confederation era and the external relations they had with with London during the Great War?
Well, I think when you talk about foreign policy, and sometimes we use the term international policy instead, one of the things that we don't often think of is that originally, when the British in particular came and settled here, there were people here already, and the relations between the British and the people who were already here, known now as Indigenous people, that was a form of international policy, if not foreign policy. Probably the political scientists would say it's not foreign policy because Indigenous people weren't organized as a state within the international state system, but certainly international policy among multiple peoples. Over time, as most Canadians know, the treatment of Indigenous peoples was not something that we have much to be proud of in those early periods. And British ended up being the primary force in the establishment of a true foreign policy in Canada. Foreign policy dealings in those early periods were with just two countries, with Great Britain itself, and then with the United States, because again, because of geography, especially with the technology that was available at the time. France largely left the upper North America, or British North America, after they lost the 7 Years' War to Great Britain. So for the French became much less of a direct factor in foreign policy than were the British and the Americans.
Great. So help us understand the importance of World War One, or what we call, the Great War, of Canada's relationship with Britain and getting involved in that conflict.
So Canada is obligated to be part of the First World War because at the time it is not an independent actor on the world stage. It is still part of the British Empire. So when the Empire is at war, Canada is at war. We do have some flexibility in how much we're going to contribute to that war. And as a result, that's where we get some internal debates between how much the French speakers in Quebec want to contribute and how much some of the English speakers in the rest of Canada want to contribute. We do contribute extensively to that war, and we end up quite disappointed with the way that Britain manages the war, particularly on the battlefield. That leads over the course of the war for Canada to demand greater independence in the making of foreign and defense policy decisions, which leads at the end of the war for us to have our own representation in the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which is a major step towards us being recognized as an independent actor on the world stage.
And then we went into World War II. Can you talk a
World
little
War,
bit about, yeah.
a lot changes between World War One and World War Two. These advancements in terms of Canada acting as its own independent actor and on the world stage, a lot happens in the years following the First World War. We sign an independent treaty with the United States called the Halibut Treaty in the early 90s. We begin to exercise our own independent judgment in the League of Nations, not as some Canadians would think in support of greater collective security, but actually in support of leaving Europe to its own problems. We come to the Second World War, and although we have the right to make an independent decision on whether to go to war, we are not bound by Britain anymore. Everyone really knows that we're going to end up in the war. So what our Prime Minister Mackenzie King does is the British declare war. King says, I need to recall Parliament because Parliament has to decide if Canada goes to war as an independent country. We have a government and we have a Parliament, and the legislative function has to be involved. He brings Parliament back, and very quickly in the speech from the throne, he announces that Canada is going to be going to war. Parliament approves the speech from the throne, and therefore we join the war a week after Great Britain does, further reaffirming the fact that we're our own actor, even though there was never any doubt that Canada was going to go to war because Britain was going to war.
I think this is a great opportunity for us to move on to our third question here. So the book revolves around the nature of prime ministerial responsibility towards balancing domestic and foreign affairs, beginning with the prime minister that you just brought up, King, and ending with Trudeau. Let's talk about the critical importance of the personality in charge of overall policy when Canada engaged with its allies and adversaries during the post-World War II era.
I think because diplomacy is really about person to person relationships, and because in the Canadian system, the Prime Minister is by far the most powerful actor. Relationships between prime ministers and heads of government and state in other countries can be extraordinarily crucial to the way that Canada pursues its interests on the world stage. Mackenzie King got along very well with Franklin Roosevelt, which was very helpful during the Second World War, where there were risks because of the way that the United States was trying to support Great Britain, that Canada's economy would get compromised. It didn't, because we worked out an agreement with Great Britain and specifically with the United States, that had implications for Great Britain, that protected our economy. It would have been really difficult to do that if Franklin Roosevelt hadn't been sympathetic to our situation. We similarly worked out an agreement with the United States on defense during the Second World War that was in part a product of good relations between the two governments. Relations continued to be good when King was succeeded by Louis Saint Laurent, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs who had very strong ties to his diplomatic corps and got along extremely well with other world leaders. The same could not be said for John Diefenbaker with JFK, President Kennedy in the United States. That created all sorts of difficulties during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and while Canada was trying to figure out if it would acquire nuclear weapons. The story continues throughout the rest of our history, with Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau getting along well with Jimmy Carter, but terribly with Richard Nixon. Folks will remember that Jean Chrétien and Bill Clinton got along extremely well, but Mr. Chrétien did not get along very well with George W. Bush, and the story continues throughout. So these president, prime ministerial, and prime minister to prime minister relations are extremely important throughout the history, because in our system, the prime minister has so much power over the direction of government.
So our next question touches on America a lot. So I want to focus more on the prime ministers and the rest of the world and their, idiosyncrasies, their own personalities, their own characters regarding relations with other heads of states. Can you talk a little bit more about, or give us some examples of how foreign policy was decided by those relationships?
Well, John Diefenbaker was interesting because he was a very big fan of the British Empire. He wanted to get along extremely well with Great Britain, but he announced a trade diversification program with Great Britain when he became prime minister that hadn't been thought through, and it caused the British to be furious with him and not want to deal with him very much after that fact. Pierre Trudeau, one of the things that worked very well for him is that before he became prime minister, he was Lester Pearson's parliamentary secretary, during which time he took a tour to Africa, French-speaking Africa in particular, where he became close friends with a number of senior African leaders. This became really helpful to Trudeau in the late 60s and into the early 70s, when there were debates with Quebec over who should be represented in international conferences related to education. The reason there was a debate here is that education is a provincial responsibility. So the Quebec government said, well, if it's education, it's provincial, so we want to be at these international conferences. But international conferences are foreign policy, which is a federal responsibility. And so the Trudeau government would want to say, well, it's federal, so it's our foreign minister that should be there. Eventually, what ends up happening is that at one of these conferences, the leader in the African state happens to know Trudeau personally. Trudeau cashes in a favor and makes sure that Quebec is not invited to this conference at all, which makes it much easier for this debate to be solved, and that federal representation remains paramount in Canadian representation at international conferences. Lester Pearson, prior to that, had very difficult relations with Charles de Gaulle. So at Expo 67, Charles de Gaulle comes to Canada trying to create trouble and promote Quebec's independence. Pearson ends up having to basically kick him out of the country. One of the reasons that this happens is that Pearson's French is terrible. And when you can't speak to folks who you're negotiating with in their own language, there tend to be greater difficulties than there would be otherwise.
So our final minute here regarding the prime ministers in charge. Let's talk a little bit of environmental policy, which is what you brought up in the introduction a little bit, and how much it relates to foreign policy. With people who are alive today and lived through the distinction between Harper and Trudeau, can you talk a little bit about how important it was of the leader in power?
Yeah, I think the environmental policy, we have a couple of examples. With the Kyoto Protocol, it's Jean Chrétien who is adamant about the targets that we're going to face. Chrétien bucks what his foreign policy advisors are telling him because he's spoken to Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton has asked him to put the target at a certain place. And so if it's not for Chrétien and Clinton, we would have had much more realistic targets when it came to the Kyoto Protocol. Mr. Trudeau himself, Justin Trudeau, tremendously committed to environmental reform, and as a result pushes that issue to the front of his foreign policy agenda in a way that previous prime ministers had not. Again, were it not for the prime minister, Canada's agenda would have looked quite different.
Great. Let's move on to our fourth question. You've brought it up already, but it's such an important aspect of Canada's history and foreign policy is the role of America. It plays such a leading role in your book because it's the globe's premier power, our southern neighbor. Give us your assessment of the effectiveness of Canadian foreign policy as its leaders balance the relationship with the US and their desire to be significant world players in their own right.
I think that generally speaking, if you adjust the way that you evaluate Canada's effectiveness towards what is realistic as opposed to what is desired, I think that you'll find that throughout the history, we do a reasonable job of balancing what you rightly suggest are the two big priorities in Canadian foreign policy. One is a good relationship with the United States, and one is supporting a liberal international world order based on themes like order, which means rules, and working multilaterally, which means not working just in an individual basis with other countries, but working within groups, because generally speaking, when we work within groups, we can leverage our partners so that we aren't overwhelmed by the most powerful countries. So generally speaking, we've been able to manage those two groups of priorities, the North American ones and the internationalist ones, because for much of our history, the United States has also preferred a liberal, multilateral world order based around a system of laws that the United States largely set up. Where we've had challenges, for example, the Second Iraq War, the United States wanted to pursue a conflict that the United Nations Security Council did not want to pursue. And so our two priorities, good relations with the Americans and this peaceful, orderly, legal international world structure, came into conflict. And that if we wanted to support the United Nations, we had to say no to the Americans. If we wanted to support the Americans, we had to say no to the United Nations. Mr. Chrétien, our book suggests, might have considered supporting the Americans even in spite of the United Nations if their evidence that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction had been credible, but he did not believe their evidence, and as a result it was actually an easy choice for him to say no to the United States and support the United Nations Security Council, which had not sanctioned America's interventions. There are times in our history where we struggle to balance the two. Usually that has taken place when the Americans have not been consistent with their support for an international order that they largely built.
So we have about 90 more seconds. Let's return to the question about Canada wanting to be a significant world player. Or, I've heard this term used multiple times in the media and in academic articles, punching above their weight. Is that an accurate statement? Are we doing that? Have we done that?
There were times, largely after the Second World War, and occasionally in the later 90s, when Canada put a disproportionate emphasis in terms of its suite of policy tools on interacting on the world stage. After the Second World War, the reason we were able to do more than a country our size would be expected to have done was largely not so much because of us, but because Europe had been crushed by the Second World War. China had just come out of a civil war and was not interacting all that much. Russia was still, it was a threat, but it was a threat that was so isolated from what we were doing that within the free world, we were a significant player. Also, because we were a significant player in the free world that was not the United States, we had relationships with a whole bunch of countries that the Americans couldn't deal with, which made us, relatively speaking, much more important than we should have been based on our size. This happens a little bit in the 1990s, the later 90s with Lloyd Axworthy, and before that, somewhat with Brian Mulroney for two different reasons. Brian Mulroney and the Progressive Conservatives are able to allow Canada to punch above its weight because our relationship with the United States is so good that the rest of the world knows that if they can't reach the United States alone, going through Canada is probably the best way. So we had added relevance in the world that was unusual. Our relationship with the Americans wasn't quite as good when Lloyd Axworthy was foreign minister under Jean Chrétien as prime minister, but Axworthy leveraged relations with all of the so-called middle powers in the world at a time when the great powers weren't fighting. And because the great powers weren't really fighting, there was space for non-great powers to do more than they normally could because they weren't crowded out. So again, we were able to advance initiatives like the landmines ban that we wouldn't normally have been able to advance in the normal course of international events.
That was an excellent summary. Let's move on to our final question. It seems there is a transformation underway over the past few decades with regard to geopolitics, and Canadians are beginning to understand that we need competent and energetic decision makers in charge of foreign policy. What lessons should future prime ministers and policymakers learn from your book?
Lesson number one, when it comes to the preamble that you've set up there, is that effective foreign ministers have to be there for a long time. One of the strengths of diplomacy is your ability to leverage relationships you've already built. If you're only a foreign minister for 6 months to a year to 18 months, you don't have time to build the relationships that you will later need when the crisis arrives. It's often said that a crisis is the worst time to build relationships. You need them already. What that means is that you really have to take your selection of foreign ministers seriously and then commit to it and leave them in charge for a long enough period that they can actually build up the network that they will later draw upon when they're trying to actually get things done. So that would be step one. Step two is that in the grand scheme, it is far better for leaders of countries like Canada to underpromise and overdeliver when it comes to foreign policy. Generally speaking, Canadians have been extraordinarily disappointed, especially in the last 20 years, of their position in the world, quite often not because of what we've actually done, but more because of the expectations that have been set up by our leadership in terms of what's actually possible for us to get done. When they set up utterly impossible and unbelievable expectations, we're bound to be disappointed. The older tradition was the diplomatic tradition is that you don't boast, you just get things done. You underpromise, you overdeliver. It's a far more effective way. Being clear with the public about what our true interests are and being modest about how often and how appropriate it is to push our values onto countries that aren't interested in them would be helpful as well. So what I'm really talking about is modesty, moderation, and a great deal of humility, something that has been lacking more often than not in our recent foreign policy past.
So to end this question in terms of lessons for future Canadian leaders, could you point to one specific prime minister or one specific case study that you believe Canada was effective on, that it did what you just said, they underpromised and it overdelivered?
I often think back to the first Iraq War. Canada's on the United Nations Security Council with the most successful election there had ever been to the council on a contested election. We are unbelievably popular around the world. Prime Minister Mulroney and Prime Minister Reagan get along extremely well. Prime Minister Mulroney and Reagan's successor will also get along extremely well. So we have good relationship with the president and the vice president, George H.W. Bush. And the Americans are thinking about going into Iraq without United Nations approval, and there's a debate within the United States over whether to do so or not. Prime Minister Mulroney coordinates with our ambassador to the United Nations, Yves Faultier, in a meeting of the Security Council. Faultier pushes the Americans and says, you really need to go through the council. That's the only way to bring everyone together. Normally, these meetings within the council stay within the council. But when Faultier comes out of the meeting room, the press says, well, what did you talk about? And Faultier said, well, I told the Americans that they really need to go through the council on this. The Americans were not ready for this. They were actually furious because they hadn't made a decision which way they were going to go. But Faultier knew that Mulroney could smooth out any frustration in the United States. And this is one of the factors that pushed the Americans to go through the UN when it came to Iraq 1.
So I think that's a great example. And I remember reading it when I got to that section of thinking like, this is exactly where Canada shines.
Yes, we leverage the relationships we have. We take advantage of what leverage we have, and we do it very carefully. We pick our spots. We don't promise more than we can, and we make sure that we have the relationships in place and that we're able to put meat to our promises. In other words, after the Americans say we're going through the United Nations, Canada, of course, volunteers to contribute militarily as much as is necessary to make that engagement effective and successful.
Great. That is the end of our fifth question. We are here with Adam Chapnick, the author of Canada First, Not Canada Alone. Thank you so much for joining us on Books in Five. And if you're willing, we are hoping to ask you a few bonus questions.
Bonus questions sound great, and it's been a pleasure to be here with you.
Great, Adam. Let's start with number one. How did you get interested in foreign policy broadly? How did you become a professor? Talk a little bit more about your journey to where you are at the moment.
I originally wanted to teach high school. I went to a concurrent education program at Trent University that was tied to Queen's. I wanted to teach high school. I wanted to teach gifted high school. And then I realized while I was at Trent that all the gifted kids went to university, or seemingly all of them did. So I realized that I wanted to teach university. I always wanted to teach history, and it was always political and diplomatic history. So eventually I kept working on those subjects, led me to do a Master's of International Affairs at the Norman Paterson School at Carleton University, where I could take history and international affairs at the same time. Did a PhD in Canadian political history at the University of Toronto, looked for a job, was unsuccessful for a bit, and then all of a sudden got an opportunity at a place I hadn't heard of at the time, the Canadian Forces College, which is part of Royal Military College. They hired me, and I have had a permanent position ever since, where I've been able to continue to ask questions that make me curious about Canada and its place in the world, and talk about them with senior military professionals, which keeps everything real and keeps me honest.
I think you're exactly where you need to be, Adam. A second question we have for you is, what are you most proud of with regard to your work?
That's a good question. I consider the most important contributions I can make in this sphere in the classroom more than anywhere else. So I'm most, if you're asking about my scholarly work, I'm most proud of anything that actually gets used around a table of younger or older people discussing Canada and its place in the world. So in some ways, I don't even know what greatest, because I it's not the metrics that matter to me. It's the effect that it has on students and future leaders of this country.
That's a very well put answer. Our final question we have for you, Adam. What are you working on in the future? What are you excited about for the next few years?
So I'm just about finished a project that I'm working on with a former National Security Intelligence advisor to the Canadian Prime Minister, Vincent Rigby, on the history of the Office of Canada's National Security and Intelligence Advisor. It's a position that has officially been in existence since 2003, 2004, unofficially really began in 1985, and we don't know very much about it and how it's evolved. And for me, it seems to tell a story about a country that every so often gets a little bit more serious about national security, then forgets it for a little while, and then gets more serious again. And I've been fascinated by how the development of the office can tell us a lot about what our country thinks of what matters in terms of national security in the world.
Great. That was the end of our bonus questions, Adam. Thank you so much for joining us again on Books in Five. The title of the book is Canada First, Not Canada Alone. You should definitely go read it, buy it, and check it out because it is such an important topic. Canada's foreign policy. Adam Chapnick, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The host of Books in Five is Bhavan Sodhan. Books in Five is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.